Thank you very much. I wanted to thank Professor Sheckman and the committee and the ministry for inviting me. I've only just met Oded this morning, but I feel like we're old friends because we have been exchanging emails for weeks. This is the most elaborate PowerPoint presentation I have ever done. The substance is mine. The technical side is Oded's, so you can decide which you like and give appropriate thanks. I want to start with a few disclaimers. First, as far as I know, I am not related to Manuel Trachtenberg, although I hope to meet him. Secondly, my presentation, in a way, if it weren't Israel, I would say I'm going to piggyback on Dr. Noy's presentation. I guess I'll say it anyway. I'm going to piggyback on her presentation because there are some linkages. Yeah. 1 second, we'll get rid of this. My presentation is very much of the macro tradition rather than the micro tradition. Some of my critics in the States say, how do I know anything about education? It's like I'm flying a plane at 35,000 feet. I can't really see what's happening on the ground. I can't really feel what's happening on the ground. And I guess my response is, yes, it's a problem. I wish I could be on the ground more, but there are advantages to being at 35,000 feet. You tend to see the big picture. You tend to see interrelationships that might not be apparent if you're on the ground. And you tend to even sometimes to be able to see the horizon. So you have a sense of where you're going, which maybe get obscured if you're on the ground. I'm interested more in, I consider myself a scholar and a researcher, but to be quite honest with you, I don't have the patience to engage in purely theoretical research and hope that somebody will someday find it useful. I'm much more interested in doing work that I can see translates into some kind of change in reality. The third related disclaimer is when I look back over my long career, and law, not education, is actually my professional discipline. I've never done formal coursework or gotten a formal degree in education. But I like to think I've learned something about it in 45 years that I've been engaged in this activity. But my passion is advocating especially for poor children, especially for children who are disabled, especially for children who are disadvantaged. And unfortunately, in my country and in yours, there are far too many of those children, and I think far too few voices advocating effectively on their behalf. The macro approach is no less complicated than the micro approach, the within-school approach. And let me see if I can get this to work. I picked two quotes that I like very much that I think demonstrate the complexity of parenting and the role parents will play in education. The first, John Dewey, probably more responsible for the creation of a system of public education in the United States than any other single person. And he said, what the best and wisest parent wants for his own child, that must the community want for all its children. Any other ideal for our schools is narrow and unlovely. Acted upon, it destroys our democracy. And to me, that's a very core belief, one to which I subscribe, one to which the major litigation in New Jersey I've been involved in, and I'll say a few words about it later, is really dedicated. The best book about that litigation called Abbott versus Burke. Burke being the then Commissioner of Education for the state of New Jersey, Abbott being an individual student representing all the students in all of the urban school districts in New Jersey. That's about 300,000 students. So in Abbott against Burke, the best book written about it was called Other People's Children. And it was called that because the underlying problem was too many parents said, well, of course I want the best for my child, but how can you use my tax money or resources for other people's children? And I think it invokes Dr. Noy's comment about the potential for a clash between equality concepts and concepts of parental control, parental choice, wanting the best for their individual child. And the second quote speaks to that point. It's from a well-known psychoanalyst, Eric Fromm, who said, few parents have the courage and independence to care more for their children's happiness than for their success. I think for too many parents, the child becomes a proxy for the parent, and the child's success becomes the parent's success. And if the child doesn't succeed in the way the parent wants, then the parent has somehow failed. And the happiness of the child, the sense of satisfaction, the finding the child's own path seems to be relegated to second place. There's a very interesting, pungent, funny, biting education commentator in New Jersey and the US called Alfie Kohn. And I don't know whether any of you have read his work, but I recommend that you do. This may test your English language ability or your age or knowledge, but there used to be a company that marketed something called Preparation H. Preparation H was a treatment for hemorrhoids. For those of you who don't know what it is, look it up because I don't want to get into the details of it. But Alfie Kohn wrote a series of articles in which he used the phrase Preparation H. But he meant something different. What he meant, with all respect to Professor Hill, was that Preparation H was the extraordinary lengths some parents went to prepare their child to go to Harvard. And that their success in life depended on their ability for their child to succeed in reaching Harvard. I am not saying, and please don't understand me to say, that the parent ought not to be the focus of this conversation. And I've used the first time, but not otherwise, parent or caretaker, because there's some who are not natural parents who do assume responsibility. But I think in general, parents have or should have the deepest and most abiding interest and most substantial role in connection with their children. They are or ought to be closest to their children and hopefully most knowledgeable about them. We've heard a lot of presentations raising some questions about how ready children are to be known by their parents, to communicate with their parents. All of us who've had children and grandchildren now, in my case, know about that reality. But still, the theory, and I think why courts like the Israeli Supreme Court and the US Supreme Court have found parental rights in some kind of natural law, not because they're embedded explicitly in constitutions as we have in the US, or basic laws as you have here, or regular laws or policies and regulations, but because it just seems right as a matter of nature that parents have a central role. And broadly speaking, I think the parental role can be micro, that is day-to-day, what happens in the school, in the class, and with the teacher, or it can be macro. And as I've indicated, I'm focusing on the latter, on the macro role. But the parents aren't the only one that matter. One old African proverb that's gotten a lot of currency in politics around the world is the proverb that says it takes a village to raise a child, and I think if that applies, it also takes a village to educate a child well. But there's a paradox. Often the more people who are involved in the educational process, the more complex and difficult it can become. So who lives in the educational village other than the parent and child? I'm going to have a long list. I'm not going to stop on them. But I think putting them up one by one and the number of them suggests why it is complex. And in fact, why it's quite likely that not everybody's going to see the educational circumstances of the child and the educational response to those circumstances in exactly the same way. Dr. Noy has mentioned the role of courts here. I think in fairness, they have to pale by comparison with the role courts in the United States have played in terms of getting heavily involved. The case I mentioned, Abbott against Burke, started in 1970. It's still going on. The New Jersey Supreme Court, the highest court in our state, has issued 27 opinions over those years in that case, most of them strongly supporting the rights of children to equality of treatment. And I'll defer for a moment a few more words about that. I think there are a couple of educational and demographic realities that are perhaps not pleasant, but nonetheless which I suspect the U.S. and Israel share. First, for the U.S., it has a rapidly growing Hispanic and Asian population, a still large black population. Incidentally, those so-called minority populations in some states have already become the majority of the total population and of the school population. We have severe residential and educational segregation, and we have large student achievement gaps along racial and economic lines. So we have hardly perfected the concept of equality, meaningful equality in the US. But how about Israel? Israel has rapidly growing Haredi and Arab populations, a still large new immigrant population, severe, although perhaps not as severe as the US, residential and educational segregation, and large achievement gaps along ethnic, religious, and economic lines. So I think the challenges we confront, and incidentally, one of the reasons I'm spending the center 3 months of a 9-month sabbatical year in Israel is because I think there are similar problems and maybe similar solutions being attempted or being considered. The only table I'm going to put up is really derived from my good friend Dan Gibton at Tel Aviv University. It's something he had in a presentation a couple of years ago to the AERA. And I won't stop on it, except you know this better than I. Israel has an incredibly complex education system. There is already choice built into it, at least as to the stream or type of education. But the so-called recognized schools, I understand, are proliferating, and that imposes choice. And I want to stop for a minute on compulsory education, because in my thinking, it's kind of the linchpin, the core of a lot of work I've begun to do. In New Jersey and in a lot of states, the compulsory education law really speaks to parental choice, because what it says is to satisfy that law, and it's a law imposing an obligation on parents, not on students. The parents are subject to a misdemeanor, a minor criminal offense, if their child does not meet the compulsory education law. How do you meet it? The child has to either attend a public school or receive, quote, equivalent instruction elsewhere. And it's the phrase equivalent instruction that I have focused on in the US and that I know some people here are focusing on, because it embodies not only the concept of equality, equal resources, equal curricula, equally qualified teachers, the same size classes, the equally effective buildings for educating students. But I think it also, and we have experienced this in my own state as well, we happen to have a community with a very large ultra-Orthodox population where, like I understand is often the case here, boys of secondary school age essentially receive no secular instruction at all. Many of them are instructed in Yiddish and emerge from high school not even speaking English. And that has become a huge problem because in the US, and I know to some extent here, it has become a serious social and economic concern as well as a serious educational concern. So I'm not here to answer that question. Wiser heads than mine will have to do it, but I'm here to point out that it's a real problem. And in a sense, it is a problem caused by parental choice. Parents have chosen for religious or other reasons certain forms of education. Just one comment here. You'll note the differing levels of public funding for the different streams, and also the substantially different numbers of students. These numbers are a couple of years old, but I think they're still fairly reflective. To step back for a minute, a little broader look at the rights and responsibilities of parents. First, the rights. We have this kind of natural law notion that parents generally have the right to direct the upbringing of their children in all respects, not just educationally. And that means they have the right, in effect, to make a wide range of decisions about the child's life. And it includes living conditions, it includes health, education, religion, culture, entertainment, travel, and on and on. In a way, the parents have a right, either directly or derivatively, that is through their children, to certain public services for the child, whether those are medical services or, for today's purposes, educational services. Parents are really the enforcer of those rights on behalf of their children. But parents also have a set of responsibilities. They have to meet various obligations. There are a lot of cases in the US courts about parents who, for religious or other reasons, are opposed to vaccinations of their children. Vaccination is required for children to attend the school. The child will be unable to attend if unvaccinated. So that's a conflict. Compulsory education, I've mentioned. To meet religious or moral obligations, that's more an internal than an external obligation of parents. And to make it possible for the child to benefit from public services, including, of course, education. And then what are the sources? Well, these I'm not going to stop on much at all, but you know about them. I think national or subnational constitutions, not so much an issue here. A huge issue, a huge source of parental rights and child rights and responsibilities in the US. Judicial pronouncements, as I've indicated, I think are growing more important here than they once were. They've been important in the US for many decades, probably ever since 1954, when the United States Supreme Court decided the case of Brown against Board of Education and said segregated schools as a matter of law are unconstitutional. But I wanted to take a moment to detour a little bit away from the world of theory to the world of practice and reality. And although undeniably, incidentally, I'm talking more parental choice now than involvement. Parental choice in terms of policy, parental choice in terms of the kind of basic decision about what kind of school a child should attend. I'm not talking about accepting those as givens and then focusing, and I'm not denying the importance of this, but focusing on what happens day to day in the classroom. How does the teacher treat the pupil? How does the child treat the teacher? And all the rest. Those are important and ground level issues, but I'm now speaking about parental choice in a much more, well, elevated is the wrong word because I don't want to establish a priority, but a much higher altitude way. The problem is, in my experience, some parents are more equal than others, and there are a lot of reasons. Parents are wealthier or poorer. Parents are better educated or less well educated. Parents are more established professionally or less established professionally. Parents can afford to live in neighborhoods that are known to have good schools or not. And on down the list. Parents have different values about education. The reality, as I've experienced it, is that some parents simply have more voice and choice than others. Now, you might say, and that has fed an argument in the United States, well, let's publicly fund choice for poor parents, and then they'll be equal to wealthier parents. Were it that easy? And there's a lot of opposition, legally and otherwise, in the U.S. to that kind of an approach. As I think Dr. Noy suggested, that may lead in the direction of the destruction of public education. It's related to John Dewey's quote that I started with. So if some parents have more voice and choice than others, that seems to me to mean some children wind up being more equal than others in terms of their educational experience. They get more and better education, perhaps, or at least substantially different education. And greater parental choice may increase educational inequalities and differences in the education children experience. Greater parental choice may therefore impose upon the state greater responsibility to equalize educational opportunities or to accept the consequences of inequality. I have to detour for 1 minute to reminisce. The first time I spent a sustained period of time in Israel was in 1980-81. I had a sabbatical year which I spent at Hebrew University at the law faculty. I was heavily engaged in New Jersey in this equalizing litigation, and so it was natural for me to come here and say, well, is there a similar basis in Israel for bringing the same kind of legal action to try to equalize educational opportunities and resources? And I looked around, and I actually wound up having a kind of deep throat in the Watergate vernacular in the then chief scientist at the Ministry of Education, who said, well, I have some data I can share with you. It's not quite public, but I can share it with you. And it was data about the extent of inequalities between Jewish schools and Arab schools, between established Jewish communities and new immigrant communities, between one geographic area and another. And they were stark. I have to tell you, they were as great as the disparities we tried to confront in New Jersey. And just to give you an idea, the disparities we dealt with in New Jersey were on an order of 2 to 1 to 5 to 1. That is, some children were having as much as 5 times as much spent on their education as other children. And perversely, it was the most disadvantaged children who were having the least spent on their education. It's taken us 40 years in the court to reverse that, and we have reversed it. But I came up with a theory and presented it to the faculty, the law faculty at Hebrew University, Well, why don't you bring a case like the case we have in New Jersey here? And it would be only slightly unkind to say I was kind of booed out of the room for suggesting that, not just politically and economically, but that I just didn't understand Israeli law. I have to say, as somebody who's tended to follow Israeli law, I wasn't entirely wrong about the possibilities, and there have been some cases that have ventured in that direction. On that, let me just say a couple of words about the New Jersey case. And this is not an argument for why the lawyers in the country should run out tomorrow and start developing this kind of case here. But the case of Abbott against Burke, first, has brought about huge increases in state-level education funding. By huge, I mean literally many tens of billions of dollars of extra funding that went to poor children, mostly black and Hispanic, in poor urban districts. And New Jersey, in a way, unlike other states and other countries, all of our urban districts are poor. No matter how you measure poverty, they're poor. They're populated almost entirely by poor people of color. They don't have property wealth. There are businesses there, but oftentimes the business areas close up before it gets dark because everybody leaves to go back out to the leafy suburbs, as we call them. We didn't just pump money in. And this is all by explicit court order, so you can imagine how involved our highest court got in these issues. Every school had to have, it started at the elementary level, a program of whole school reform to try to use the money effectively. Wraparound services, so-called. Extended school day, extended school year, nutritional services, medical services, dental services, eye checkups, counseling services, all in the school, using the school as the base for that. State-funded, full-day, high-quality early childhood education for all 3- and 4-year-olds in those districts. And they number about 70,000. State-funded construction programs. Literally every school in every one of those 31 urban school districts was to be renovated or replaced by a new building. And finally, there was to be accountability for results. It was not just throw the money at them, give them some broad guidelines, and then go home. The current status of the case, I think, shows how hard it is to hold on to major gains in education funding and services, despite a lot of notable successes. It's a constant fight. We haven't gone back to the court 30 times or more because we like being there or they like having us there. We go there because the state doesn't seem able to appropriate the money to fully fund the statutory formula. I suspect that's a problem here. I know Yair Lapid, among others, came in with an idea of dramatically investing in the schools, and now the reality seems to be that's not happening to the degree expected. Well, that's a global phenomenon. But I think the case, and it's a case obviously I can't be objective about. I've been involved in it from day one and continue to be involved. But I think it's the most important and expansive educational equalization effort in the US and probably in the world. The New York Times referred to it in an editorial some years ago as the most important education case since Brown against Board of Education, and so that's a source of great pride. But the problem continues, the problem of it being seen as other people's children, the problem of Dewey's quote coming home, that it will undermine our democracy if we can't bring ourselves voluntarily to do it. And Just one other word, and then I'm going to move ahead toward completion. I spent the fall in Toronto looking at the Ontario education reform system, and it is very impressive. And people looked at me with mystification when I described this 40-year involvement in the court to achieve equality. They said, well, of course, why wouldn't you spend more money on disadvantaged children if you're serious about wanting to equalize educational opportunity? How can you expect to provide them with equal chances given the disadvantage they start with unless you provide heavy resources and the best teachers and the best program? So in some societies, it seems to be obvious to them that that's the way to go. Unfortunately, in other societies, it's not, and it's a fight every inch of the way. And I mentioned the fight here over secular education for Haredi students and equalizing educational opportunity and outcomes for Arab and new immigrant students. I don't think those issues have gone away in the 33 years since I first looked at them, and I was not the first to look at them. I just want to mention, I'm not going to go through these because of time, that given the broad population of the educational village, it's inevitable there are going to be differences of opinion. And I've spelled out in the slides, and I think you'll have them available, all of the different configurations, all the ways issues can arise among people who I think in honesty and candor and good conscience want to do the best educationally, but not everybody sees a unified way to do that. I liked Oded's bouncing, but I wanted to mention a couple, the last two actually, between parents of the same child. I mean, we've assumed there's some unity called the parent or the parents. There's a case I just came across, decided 5 days ago by a court in New Jersey, a case involving a dispute between two divorced parents over the education of their child. Now, what was the dispute? One parent wanted the child to go to a conservative Jewish day school, and the other parent wanted the child to go to an Orthodox Jewish day school. And that case has been rattling around in the New Jersey courts for years, and it's not finished. So I want to disabuse us all of the idea that when we talk about parent, we necessarily are talking about a unified view of what works for their child. And then finally, between a parent and a child. We've heard about some of the potential for lack of communication, miscommunication, but it goes deeper than that. There's a famous case in the US decided by the US Supreme Court some years ago called the Yoder case. And it was a case that involved whether compulsory education law should be applied to the children of Amish students. And the court wound up, to the surprise of some, saying, no, it doesn't apply because the religious beliefs of the parents are so strong about a secular secondary school education undermining their community. And the court went on to say, and it's an interesting point, actually, the court went on to say, and you know what, the Amish community is self-supporting, they're not a drain on public resources, and so why can't we honor their religious freedom? But a famous justice, Justice Douglas, said in a dissenting opinion, by the way, did anybody ask the Amish teenagers what they wanted? Suppose one of them wants to be a nuclear physicist. You know, not going to high school isn't going to help in that pursuit. So I think that there are some difficult, troublesome issues, even at the level of parent and child. Thanks, Odette. I just want to say one word about, and then conclude. Although parental choice in the sense I've been referring to it, what kind of school, what kind of form of education and the like, is very much on the table here in Israel. It is, in my view, the absolute leading hot-button educational law and policy issue in the U.S. now. And I want to mention briefly my own hometown, Newark, New Jersey. I actually born, raised, public school, educated there. I've been working there at the law school for 45 years. I have deep feelings about it. It's in total chaos because the state of New Jersey decided almost 20 years ago that the people of Newark couldn't run their own schools, as virtually every other community in the state does, and the state had to come in and operate the schools. And now the state says, well, we can't leave because the schools are so terrible and student performance is so bad, how can we possibly return it to the local community? And there's been a total lack of respect for the local community and its ability to know what kind of education it wants for its children and to be able to manage that education. We have districts like the New Orleans district, which after the big storm has become an all-charter school district. And that's the pattern that's at work, and without going into the gory details, there's a lot of big money spent on public education and a lot of billionaire hedge fund people who are promoting charter schools and online instruction and other ways to access that money. So if that's a cautionary word for you here, so be it. I'm just going to jump to a couple of concluding remarks. Because I've indicated in these two slides, which you can look at your leisure, why parents would want to exercise the right of choice and how can they do it effectively. And that's about access to information, a fair and open admissions process, because a lot of these schools are selective schools, reasonable assurance that the education provided is as advertised. And that schools don't find ways to get rid of students who aren't strong test takers or very amiable and well-disciplined students. I also indicate, but I'm going to pass that by, some of the potential downsides of giving parents choice. And one of them, out of an old study by Henry Levin, is an interesting twist. He discovered in his research that parents tended to favor for their children schools that they thought would provide the kind of skill set that the parents had found helpful in their own occupational lives. So if somebody's a blue-collar worker and being able to follow orders and being disciplined and being punctual was important, well, they wanted that kind of school for their child. If somebody was a corporate CEO and problem solving ranked high, well, then they tend to favor that kind of school and that kind of educational approach. So let me just say in conclusion, it's difficult for me to imagine that any country, whether it's Israel or the US, could successfully educate its children without the support and involvement of parents. But I think there is a balance point that we have to recognize between parental involvement and choice on the one hand and the best interests of the nation and state, if I can put it that way. One of my pet peeves with education policy is that it's like the policy is on a pendulum that is constantly swinging from one extreme to the other and not stopping in the middle very often. So we either decide centralizing our schools is the way to go, or, well, we got to go to community schools and decentralizing. And we don't seem able to think our way out of that trap and say, well, there's a way to combine the best of these alternatives. It doesn't have to be all or nothing. And I think it's very much like that with parental choice. I think you have to strike an appropriate balance. The more diverse your population is, the more difficult it is to accomplish that. But in a way, the more important it is to accomplish it. So we can, I think, honor the view, as we have too often done, that education reform is about wiping the slate clean and starting over again. What it should be about is keeping the best of what we've been doing and improving it. Because I think if we just keep wiping the slate clean, or I guess these are mixed metaphors, or letting the pendulum swing freely from one end to the other, I think it's chaos. It's chaos. We need order. We need stability. Children need order and stability. They need innovation. They need space, but they also need a structure. So the role of parents has to be treated thoughtfully, and we need to find a balance point, and we need to be prepared to fine-tune it, but not simply throw it out. And I think the way to do that is to try to use the best available evidence and the fullest debate and discussion. And I think in that process, too, parents have to be active players along with other important stakeholders. Thanks very much.